Silent Night Chapter 1. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow fell softly on the city. The streets were bustling with shoppers and people out to enjoy the festive atmosphere. But for one man, this was no ordinary holiday. His name was John Miller, and he was a grieving father. His son, Michael, had been murdered by a ruthless gang 6 months ago. The police had been unable to catch the killers, and John had vowed to take justice into his own hands. John had spent the past 6 months planning his revenge. He had learned everything he could about the gang, their leader, and their hideout. He had also trained himself in hand-to-hand combat and firearms. On this Christmas Eve, John was finally ready to carry out his plan. He dressed in a black Santa Claus suit and mask, and armed himself with a silenced pistol and a combat knife. Then, he set out for the gang's hideout. The hideout was located in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. John arrived and parked his car in a nearby alley. He stepped out into the snow and made his way to the warehouse. He stopped at the door and listened. He could hear voices inside, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. He took a deep breath and opened the door. Chapter 2. John stepped inside the warehouse and found himself in a large, empty room. In the center of the room was a group of men gathered around a table, drinking and playing cards. The men looked up as John entered. They saw his Santa Claus suit and laughed. "Hey, look! It's Santa Claus," one of the men said. "What can we do for you, Santa?" John didn't say anything. He just raised his pistol and fired. The man who had spoken fell to the ground, dead. The other men reacted quickly, drawing their own guns. But they were no match for John. He was trained to kill, and he did it with ruthless efficiency. One by one, the gang members fell. Within minutes, it was all over. John stood in the center of the room, his pistol still in his hand. He looked around at the bodies, and he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had finally avenged his son's death. But then, he heard a noise behind him. He turned around and saw the gang leader standing in the doorway. The leader was a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and a scar across his face. He was holding a gun. Well, the leader said. "What do we have here? Santa Claus has come early this year." John didn't say anything. He just raised his pistol and fired. The leader ducked behind a crate. John fired again, and again. But the leader was too quick for him. "You're not going to get away with this," the leader said. "I'm going to kill you, Santa." John knew that the leader was right. He was outnumbered and outgunned. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Chapter 3. John threw his pistol down and drew his combat knife. He charged at the leader, and the two men engaged in a fierce hand-to-hand battle. John was a skilled fighter, but the leader was stronger and more experienced. He quickly overpowered John and knocked him to the ground. The leader stood over John, his gun pointed at his head. "Any last words, Santa?" the leader asked. John looked up at the leader and smiled. "Merry Christmas," he said. The leader pulled the trigger. Chapter 4. John Miller lay dead on the floor of the warehouse. But his story wasn't over. The next morning, the police arrived at the warehouse after receiving a tip-off. They found the bodies of the gang members, as well as John's body. The police investigated the scene and determined that John had killed the gang members in revenge for his son's murder. They also found a note on John's body, which explained his actions. The note read, "I am John Miller, and I am the father of Michael Miller, who was murdered by this gang 6 months ago." The police were unable to catch the killers, so I took justice into my own hands. I know that what I have done is illegal, but I don't regret it. I am finally at peace. The police released the note to the media, and it was